Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, good afternoon. My name is Nathan Jaffay, I'm Israel writer for the Forward newspaper, and it gives me great pleasure this afternoon. Before we start, I've been asked to request everyone to turn onto silent mode their mobile phones, their cell phones. It gives me great pleasure this afternoon to introduce a stupid, naive American. Those aren't my words. I wouldn't be so brazen as to insult the person sitting next to me and the person who invited me here, but that's how, in Gershon's own words, he was characterized when he made aaliyah, came to Israel in 1978. That was the reception which he got when he spoke about his ideals, spoke about his ideas for the region, a stupid, naive American. Well, I think we can say now, after the last few years, when he's been engaged in serious discussions with one of the most impenetrable organizations in the region, on one of the most impenetrable subjects, and that Gilad Shalit, in large part thanks to Gershon's help, is now at home, I think we can say that that stupidity and that naivety is not there, and we can actually take Gershon seriously and maybe have a chat with him this afternoon. So, we're going to get into this subject with Gershon, and I'm going to be asking him some questions. And for me, I have the luxury this afternoon that usually, if I don't get into the topic straight away, people can just turn over the page and move on from me. But today, you're here. You're obviously interested enough in Gershon's story to be here and hear it. So I want to rewind a little and ask Gershon a few questions about himself as we get started. So Gershon, can you start by telling us, back in 1978, what was the background to your coming to Israel, and what were these ideals that you came with that made people say stupid and naive?
Well, I suppose the story starts some years before that. As a child growing up in northeast of the United States, in New York, growing up in a very Jewish neighborhood in Long Island, at a young age, and I think my first encounter with something that shook my world was on a trip that my family made to the south of the United States. We were in Virginia, and I encountered a restaurant that said whites only on it. This was I was a 9-year-old kid there. It was a few months before the US Congress passed the Civil Rights Act. And that was the first encounter I had as a child with something that was outside of my frame of reference. It was completely shocking. We're in the mid-60s at this time. War in Vietnam is going on, and I became a political activist at the age of 9, 10 years old, 11, 12. When I was 12 years old, the 1968 presidential elections that were very important in the United States, and I joined the campaign of Eugene McCarthy, who was a liberal Democratic senator running for president on a ticket against the war in Vietnam and for civil rights in the United States. This was my world growing up at that point. As a Jew in America, living in a very Jewish neighborhood, I had never encountered anti-Semitism. My worldview was not shaped from anyone being against me. In fact, I grew up with a very positive Jewish identity and self as a Jew in America. When I was 14 years old, we moved to a different community, which was very not Jewish. And my first week in my new school, I was approached by someone who had spent a summer in Israel and said, we're forming a chapter of Young Judea, a Zionist youth movement, and invited me to come. And I went. It was interesting. It's a good place to meet Jewish girls. And I joined and got very active. By the time I was a senior in high school, my last year in high school, I was president of the Long Island region of Young Judea. Spent a year in Israel after high school, decided that Israel was my home. It's where I felt that I belonged in the world. Came back to America after the year and realized that in this year of intensive study that I'd spent in America, I never spoke to a Palestinian the whole year I was in Israel. There was this big gap in my understanding. Make a long story short, started reading everything I could find, and there was a meshing of my liberal values with regard to civil rights and anti-war, and my Jewish Zionist identity that in 1976 I wrote my first article in a newspaper in which I called for the two-state solution. Well, this was the background that brought me here in 1978. I moved here my first 2 years living in Israel. I did community service in a Palestinian Arab village in Israel, where I worked in a program called Interns for Peace. trying to develop programs of interaction between Jewish and Arab communities inside of Israel.
I think you told me that you said that you made Aliyah to an Arab village.
I made the only person in Israel who's ever made Aliyah to an Arab village. Yeah. So after that, I sold myself to the Israeli government. I became the first civil servant in Israel responsible for Jewish-Arab relations in Israel, worked in the Ministry of Education. Through that, I helped to create a department in the Ministry of Education for Democracy and Coexistence, established the Institute for Education for Jewish-Arab Coexistence, which was in partnership with the Prime Minister's Office. Menachem Begin was Prime Minister at the time, and the Ministry of Education. And I did that until the first Intifada broke out.
And in terms of the first Intifada, because I wanted to ask you about this, perhaps in parallel to the day that Gilad Shalit was captured, because it seems that there have been two very important moments in your career and in what you've been doing here. One of them was clearly the day the Intifada broke out, because you're going to tell us what you did, what happened that day. And then I want to ask you after that, kind of, if there's a parallel, kind of the strong feelings on that day and what you felt when you heard that Gilad Shalit had been captured.
Well, as you said, for both of these days, these were historic moments in our history. My taking action at the first Intifada wasn't on the day that it broke out, but several days into the first Intifada, I began to read the political leaflets. Those of you who are around, those of you who remember, those of you who study history, might recall that in the first days of the first Intifada and throughout the first year of the first Intifada, they were putting out leaflets from something called the United Command of the Intifada, which was a body made up of the four main political parties that made up the PLO. And the linguistics, the arguments, the claims that the Palestinians were making in the first Intifada from the very beginning were no longer what appeared in the PLO charter about Israel not having a right to exist and throw the Jews into the sea or removing Israel. What they talked about was ending the occupation and establishing a state next to Israel. Now for me that was a critical moment because in 1976, when I wrote my first article in favor of the two-state solution, I also went to speak to the PLO ambassador in New York, Mr. Terzi, and I, in a private meeting behind closed doors, said, I think that the PLO should recognize Israel and should accept the two-state solution. Mr. Terzi's response to me at that time was, over my dead body. We will never recognize Israel, we'll never accept the two-state solution. My sense was that it had to come. And the beginning of the first Intifada, it came. That moment of entry for dialogue with the Palestinians that I was waiting for had arrived. And what I did was I quit my job as the director of the Institute for Jewish-Arab Coexistence and began to create IPCRI. The idea of creating a joint Israeli-Palestinian think tank that would work on resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in partnership as a joint Israeli-Palestinian body, sharing the idea that this conflict had to be resolved on the basis of the two-state solution. On the day that Gilad Shalit was kidnapped, I was actually in Jordan. We were just finishing a conference of the Israeli-Palestinian Peace NGO Forum. We were sitting on our bags, literally waiting to go home, and we heard that there was an attack at Keren Shalom and Gilad Shalit was kidnapped. I didn't know at that moment how involved I was going to get in that story, but what preempted it, actually, for my involvement was that a year before, a close relative of my wife was kidnapped by Hamas. He disappeared, and he was missing, and someone from the family called me and said, he's missing, can you help us maybe use your contacts in Palestine to see if they could hear if anything happened to him? I was actually in Switzerland at the time at a conference, and I called up my partner Hannah Senora and asked Hannah. Hannah went to Ramallah and started asking around for my wife's cousin if anyone had heard anything. No one had heard anything. A few days later, Hamas issued a videotape with this man who was blindfolded and his hands were tied and he was bleeding. He had obviously been tortured. And a few days later, they found his body. He was brutally murdered. I couldn't help him. And I'd sworn to myself then that if ever again something happened that I could help in protecting a human life, that I would do everything possible. 6 months before Shalit was kidnapped, I was at a conference in Cairo, and I was introduced by a friend from Hamas, a friend from Gaza, to a professor of economics from the Islamic University in Gaza, who came to this conference in Cairo to meet an Israeli. I was the first Israeli he ever met. He was the first Hamas person I ever met. We struck up a conversation, dialogue for about 6 hours, and continued our talk for months later, trying to see if we could establish a dialogue. I'm not giving his name because several years later, he did come to a meeting that we arranged in Ankara with Israelis without permission from Hamas or the university. And when he came back to Gaza from that meeting, he found out that he lost his job. So in order not to cause him any more problem, I haven't mentioned his name anywhere. But that's how it all began. On the day, 3 days after Shalit was kidnapped, the professor called me and said, Gershon, our situation is really bad, we're being bombed, we have no electricity, the kids are screaming, everyone's afraid, do something. And I didn't know what to do. He said, let's try and open up a line of communication between the soldier's father, Nathan Jaffay, and Hamas, and that's what we did on that day.
And kind of the feeling of not being empowered with relation to your wife's cousin. I mean, some suggest that this whole area is the bottom line. This is the real test for the Israeli left. The Israeli left faces criticism all the time that it's not actually promoting the security of the state. It's not actually saving lives, and that the right-wing critics would say its plans actually put the nation at risk. Is this kind of work, this kind of aim of actually helping to problem solve when people's lives are at risk, is that kind of a big test for the Israeli left?
I'm not sure. I think that most of the people that I know in the Israeli left care a great deal about Israel and about Israel's welfare, and the accusations made by the Israeli right against the Israeli left that we care more about the Arabs than we do about ourselves and our own state, I think is false. And I think it's part of the right-wing propaganda about what the left stands for and what the left is trying to do. I know I can speak for myself. Everything I have ever done in my life to advance peace and coexistence has been because I consider myself a loyal citizen of the state of Israel that I care about. And I do what I do as a Zionist. I have my own definition of what that means, but as a Jew and a loyal Israeli. One of the amazing things about this whole Shalit involvement of mine and the positive results at the end is that I've been embraced by everyone, right to left. This is an issue that cut across Israel. Almost 90% of Israelis support the deal, and people stop their cars in the street and come over and hug me, and I was interviewed in 2 Haredi newspapers, ultra-Orthodox newspapers, an interview on the secular radio, and just everyone has praised me. And a lot of people from the left actually sent me emails and on Facebook and said, you did a great service to us in the peace camp in the left, because it shows that we do care about Jews and Israelis and not just about the other side.
Mm-hmm. I would hope to return later to the question which this subject raises, which is the very obvious question of the Israeli public across the political spectrum embracing what you did on this kind of area, but seeing it very differently for the macro larger issue of the peace process. But for now, I wanted to continue with the story of how things progressed from your meeting with this professor, and how kind of the massive jump was made from this meeting to a point where you were actually helping with these negotiations. So tell us about the kind of first contact with Hamas.
That day that the professor called me, he drove to Prime Minister Ismail Haniyeh's office in Gaza, and half an hour later, I was amazed by how fast it was. I received a phone call from the Director General of the Hamas Prime Minister's office, Dr. Mohammed Madhoun, who introduced himself and told me that later in the morning, someone else would be calling me and he would be my liaison to the Prime Minister's office. And about an hour later, Dr. Razi Hamad called me. Dr. Razi Hamad was at the time the spokesperson of the government. Razi and I began a conversation. The immediate interesting thing about the conversation was that Razi spoke to me in Hebrew, which was very unusual for me. Most Palestinians I either speak in my bad Arabic or we speak in English. Very few Palestinians that I know I speak to in Hebrew, and here's this spokesperson of the Hamas government who calls me and speaks to me in Hebrew, and when I suggested we move to English, and he speaks perfect English, he said, no, let's speak Hebrew. So this was...
Where did he pick up his Hebrew?
In prison, of course. Israeli prison, of course. It was clear to me from the conversation with him, the very first conversation, that there was a human touch to it. Razi was the one who suggested that I try to call the soldier's father. He didn't say try to contact your prime minister's office that we're demanding a prisoner release. He said maybe we can talk to the soldier's father, and I thought that was quite remarkable. And I arranged a phone conversation. It took me a few hours to find Noam Shalit's phone number. And once I did and spoke to him and suggested the phone call, Noam Shalit immediately agreed, and a conversation took place between the two of them later.
Did you not fear that that could be a form of manipulation, getting Noam Shalit's feelings out there, that could somehow...
I didn't think about that. You know, I thought there was a human touch here, and I thought that the more that we could humanize a very inhuman situation, the better it would be. The big problem was that it wasn't clear who was holding Shalit and what they wanted, because there were at least 3 different Palestinian groups in Gaza who were responsible for the attack and the abduction of Shalit, and we didn't know who was in charge. It took another few weeks before it became apparent that Hamas had taken charge. And during this time, it was me calling Razi and suggesting that they provide a sign of life. This, I thought, was the most important thing, because we didn't know if he was alive. We didn't know what his welfare was. And I thought in the back of my mind that beyond a sign of life, the most important thing to do was to establish that there was a chain of communication that led to the people who were holding Shalit. That was the most important thing, that the people we were talking to...
And of course we must remember that was a different reality in the Gaza Strip then to what we have now. It's
certainly a different reality, and also we have to remember that 3 weeks after the abduction of Shalit, we had an attack on the northern border with 2 Israeli soldiers abducted there, and a war going on in Lebanon. So not only was the summer rain operation that the Israelis called it, which was a massive military operation taking place in Gaza, we now had a war going on in Lebanon. Also, we have the north of Israel being rained on with Hezbollah missiles. We had Qassams coming out of Gaza. We had Israel fighting battles in 2 locations trying to find soldiers who had been abducted, that they had no idea what happened to them. I knew that at that point that I had opened up a line of communication that I had to contact the Prime Minister. But I knew from my experiences in the past in talking to the Prime Minister's office, and Olmert in particular, who I knew personally, he knew me, and we had some relationship from the past, mostly negative from the time when he was mayor of Jerusalem. I knew that I had to find some way to get directly to him that avoided going through his office. And I thought of his daughter. Olmert's daughter is a well-known political activist. She had participated in a demonstration a while before against who was then the commander of the Israeli Air Force, who later then became the chief of staff. And I approached Dana Olmert, and I asked her if she would be willing to transmit messages from Hamas to her father and from her father back to Hamas, and she immediately agreed. She warned me, though, that she knew her father's opinions and didn't think it would help.
Tell us about the dynamic between Dana Olmert and her father. Tell us about the...
Well, I don't really know what happened there. I know that I was both talking to Dana by telephone, by SMS, and by emails. I have a whole email conversation with her, and she always expressed her desire to help. She always cautioned me that her father would not be receptive. And the messages that she transmitted back from Ehud Olmert, from the Prime Minister, were, we don't negotiate with terrorists, we don't negotiate prisoner exchanges, and we know the soldier is alive, we hold Hamas responsible. That was almost always the content of the conversations. And the first messages that were coming from Hamas about making a deal included talking about a ceasefire, talking about ending the siege of Gaza, and a prisoner exchange, and Olmert kept repeating as a mantra, we don't negotiate with terrorists, we don't release terrorists from prison, we don't trust them on a ceasefire, and we know the soldier is alive and we hold him responsible. So this was extremely frustrating. I had this communication with him, but it wasn't moving anywhere. Then Hamas came with a concrete offer, and they said that they would deliver a videotape in exchange for 350 women, prisoners, and minors. And I delivered the message. The message from Olmert was the same thing. And I tried to impress upon him through his daughter that we needed the sign of life, not because we know he's alive or not that he's alive, but because we had to establish a line of communication to the people who are holding him. But Olmert said we won't pay anything for a sign of life. For information, we wouldn't pay anything. Eventually, we negotiated it down to 1 busload of women and minors, And even to that he said no, and Hamas even agreed that the busload of women and minor prisoners could be delivered to the Muqatta in Ramallah, to Abu Mazen. And Olmert still said no. So at that point I went to Gaza. Hannah and I went to Gaza. We both had press cards, and before June of 2007, when Gaza was closed to Israelis, we could actually still go into Gaza. Of course, when we crossed the border into Gaza, we had to sign this document relieving the government of Israel from having any responsibility for our welfare. And I mean, I wasn't going to tell them I was going to speak to Hamas about Gilad Shalit, but that's what we went to do. And in the meeting in Gaza, I came up with the idea with my meeting with Razi Hamad of a letter. Let them deliver a hand-written letter from Gilad Shalit with no price. The idea was that this would establish a line of communication, would open up Olmert to begin a negotiating process. This was the idea behind the letter. Razi liked the letter. He told us to stick around in Gaza and he would get back to us. By the time dark came, we decided we should leave Gaza. We came back to Jerusalem. 2 days later, Razi Hamad called me and told me there's a letter on its way, and it will be delivered to the Egyptian representative office in Gaza, but the letter never arrived. Days went by, I'm calling Razi Hamad 10 times a day. Where's the letter? Where's the letter? My wife is telling me, he's lying to you, how can you trust him? And I said, no, he's not. I believe there's a letter, it's stuck somewhere. And it took a couple of weeks before we figured out that the political echelon of Hamas, the political leadership in Gaza, blocked the letter. They stopped it on the way, it wasn't delivered. So what do? We're now a week before Ramadan or something like that, a few days before Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. I went and I met with Noam and Aviva Shalit, and I suggested to Noam to write a letter father to Khalid Mashal.
Did this idea seem crazy to him? You know, you're asking the father to write a letter. Presumably you're asking him to not write such an angry letter to the people who are holding his son and, torturing in a sense the family and the nation.
There was no, there wasn't even a second when he didn't consider the possibility of not writing a letter. From his point of view, and I would have done the same as a father, I think that every other person in this room would have done the same, to write to anyone, to approach anyone, to talk to anyone who's going to, first of all, let me know that my son is alive and let me know how I can get him back. So Noam Shalit actually sat and met with a friend of his from Nazareth, an Arab lawyer, who helped him write the letter, and they took quotes from the Quran. It was a very, very good letter. We translated the letter to Arabic and sent it to Khalid Mashal in Damascus by fax and by email. One of the people in my office called the Hamas office in Syria to verify that in fact he did get the letter. And 2 days later, on September 9th, a Saturday morning in 2006, about 3 months after the abduction of Shalit, Razi Hamad called me at 11 o'clock in the morning and said the letter was just delivered to the Egyptian representative office in Gaza.
Now, this letter in return did not become known about by the Israeli public for a long time. Why was that?
I think it was determined. What happened immediately after the letter being delivered is about 2 weeks before, Prime Minister Olmert had finally appointed someone to be in charge. He appointed a man named Ofer Dekel, who came from the GSS, from the Shin Bet, who was going to be in charge of the prisoner release, dealing with Hezbollah and dealing with the Shalit case. He immediately contacted the Egyptians and thought that the Egyptians would mediate with Hamas. They had this representative office in Gaza. Ofer Dekel made contact with the Egyptians and had the letter delivered the following day to Israel. It was verified that it was in Shalit's handwriting, and at that point, Ofer Dekel called me and said, Gershon, thank you very much for all you've done. From this moment, you're out of the picture. This is now an official business. The Egyptians are mediating. We don't want any people bothering us in the process. The official position was that as little information in the public domain as possible will make the negotiations more smooth. They were afraid that any public attention would increase the demands of Hamas, that the more attention there was, that Hamas would demand more, would make the negotiations more difficult. That, in fact, is not true, in my opinion, even 5.5 years later. But that was the general thinking in Israel. The following day, I called up the Egyptian intelligence officer from the Egyptian embassy in Tel Aviv, someone who I'd known for a long time, Nader al-Asser, and met with him in this hotel, and told him what happened with Ofer Dekel. And Nader wasn't part of the negotiations because it was being run by the guys in Gaza, and he was in the Egyptian embassy in Tel Aviv. But he said to me, Gershon, don't listen to Ofer Dekel. We need a free agent. We need someone who can move, who can pass messages, who can present ideas, someone who's not connected to the intelligence establishment, someone who can be like yourself. So continue doing it. He encouraged me to continue to play a role, and I did.
Tell us a little bit about how we say back channel, how private your role was. Who was listening on your phone line?
At that point, I don't know. I don't know if anyone was listening because I don't think they took me very seriously. But there were 2 times during the period of Ofer Dekel when I was approached once by the Hamas side, who suggested that we try to open up a direct secret back channel. It wasn't going well with the Egyptians, and the Israelis had asked me to check with Hamas if they were interested. At that point, Hamas was not interested. Later, Hamas had asked me if the Israelis might be interested in opening up a secret direct back channel, and at that point, the other side wasn't interested. The timing was never right. I don't know if anyone was listening. As I said, I kept trying to send ideas. I kept trying to tell people that I have this connection that I thought could be fruitful. I was in contact with the Egyptians. Toward the end of the Egyptian era in the negotiations, a German mediator was brought in who successfully negotiated the deal with Hezbollah to bring back the 2 dead Israeli soldiers and a prisoner release. And then he focused more on Hamas. But I was getting messages all the time from Gaza that the German mediator was not meeting success, that he was stuck. He was coming back and forth quite often, but there was no progress. And if we could have this direct back channel, then we reached the end of the Olmert period, and Netanyahu was elected. Netanyahu appointed a new mediator on the Israeli side, someone from the Mossad named Chagai Hadass. And from day one, this is quite a humorous story, I heard Chagai Hadass's name in the morning news on the radio, and I wanted to make contact with him immediately. The first thing I did was open up Facebook to see if he had a Facebook page. He had left the Mossad, become a businessman. He had actually opened up a Facebook page. And there wasn't a whole lot of information there, but it did say where he lived. I called up 144, the information, got his home phone number, called up his daughter, answered the phone, and she gave me his cell phone number. So I called up Chagai Hadass, former Mossad agent, and told him who I was and had these contacts. And he, of course, said, I just got in the job. I don't know anything, talk to me later. I talked to him later, and he kept telling me, we don't want your involvement, there are official channels as a German mediator, etc., etc. I kept hearing from the Palestinians in Gaza that the German mediator wasn't producing anything. For months at a time, he disappeared. There was no mediation going on, it was stuck. So I kept calling, sending SMSs to Chagai Hadass. I went to speak to the Shalits. I got the phone number of the German mediator, Gerhard Conrad, and I called him up and told him who I was and started sending him messages with ideas of how to progress until he ended up not answering me anymore. He got messages from Hadass not to talk to me. In July of last year, July 2010, after the German mediation had basically finished, Razi Hamad called me again and told me, look, we want to make progress. I'm in direct contact now with Ahmed Jabri, the head of the Yazid al-Qassam, the military wing of Hamas. Razi, by the way, had been fired from his position of spokesperson of the Hamas government. He had written a very critical article in the Hamas newspaper against Hamas, basically saying we have no strategy, we lost our ideology, we don't have a direction, we don't know what we're doing. It was a thinking piece, and it was a challenging piece to the Hamas public, but he lost his job. Eventually, he was appointed to be in charge of border crossings at the political level. And in his position of being in charge of the border crossings, he became close with Ahmed Jabri, who ran the security of Gaza, the strongman of Gaza. And his relationship with Jabri developed into a friendship. And in July of 2010, Razi contacted me and sent me a fax, or sent me by email, a document with principles for renewing the negotiations, basically saying what the Hamas didn't like about the German offer. There was a German proposal on the table. All along, Israel was saying that Hamas never responded to the German proposal. And here, there was a Hamas response to the German proposal. I transmitted it to Hagai Hadass. I had to send it to the military attaché in the Prime Minister's office and asked them to deliver it. I got no response. Hadass kept telling me there's an official channel, the German, but I knew the channel was dead. So I contacted the Egyptians and asked the Egyptians to try and talk to the Israelis. We're still in the Mubarak era. Omar Suleiman, I contacted Omar Suleiman's office and dead end, completely dead.
Before we move on to the Egyptians, tell us a little more about what the problem was with the German approach, because I think that's going to be very important to understanding what succeeded about the final deal. What was wrong with the German approach? What was insufficient there?
The German had successfully locked Hamas into dealing with a set list of names. This was the big achievement of the German, because one of the problems that they faced in every round of negotiations is that Hamas Jabari would show up with a new list of names. So the fact that the German list became the basis was very important in concluding the negotiations. But I began to have suspicions about the German proposal when the new guy was appointed, David Maidan, and we began dealing with the issues in the negotiations. And the first difficulty came up was that the Hamas demanded for 1948 Arabs to be included. People who were citizens of Israel, who were engaged in terrorism, were in Israeli prison. The Israelis had always refused to release Israeli citizens in the framework of prisoner exchanges. But this is an issue that I had with the Israeli negotiating team, and I argued on it. But that wasn't what raised my suspicion here. David Maidan, the guy newly appointed by Netanyahu, told me that in the German proposal, the issue of 1948 Arabs was dealt with in Annex 13 of the agreement. I said, Annex 13? How many annexes were there in this agreement? And he said, 15. And I said, how long was this agreement, the proposal? And he said, 150 pages. I almost fell off my chair when I heard this. 150 pages. I said, did the German think that he was negotiating a merger between two German economic business concerns? I mean, does he think that Ahmed Jabari and Ezzeddin al-Qassam has a legal department that can deal with it? What happened was that the Hamas people, when they received this 150-page proposal,
fainted.
They said, this guy works for the Israelis. The person he was negotiating with was Mahmoud al-Zahar. The first thing that happened is that Jabari pushed Mahmoud al-Zahar out of the negotiations. He said, this German and Zahar are working for the Israelis. This was what happened. The Egyptians told me afterwards when I was in Cairo during the last round of negotiations, the head of the Egyptian team told me, you know, the German disappeared for 10 months. He shows up with a 150-page agreement proposal. That was the end of the negotiations. It's quite amazing.
So let's move on to what happened then and what the differences were, which you think led to the breakthrough.
In April, in this past year, Hagai Hadass resigned. The German went home. He was finished. Netanyahu appointed David Maidan. I had never heard of him before. He was the head of Tevel in the Mossad, which is the department of the Mossad responsible for the relations between the Mossad and other intelligence services around the world. Head of a department in the Mossad is the rank of general. It's a parallel to a rank of general in the military. I didn't know David Maidan, but I knew someone else who used to be in the Mossad who worked for Ehud Barak when he was prime minister. Pini Maidan was a foreign policy advisor, and later Pini Maidan did a lot of work with a lot of us in the peace field in Track 2 activities. I called up Pini and said, is David Maidan a relative of yours? He said, no. Why are you asking? I said, it has to do with Gilad Shalit. He said, okay, what do you want? I said, I want to talk to him. He said, okay. He called up David Maidan, and then Pini sent me his phone number and said, he's waiting for your phone call. So I called up David Maidan, and I told him who I was, and David said, give me 3 weeks to get organized. I don't have a desk or anything. During that 3-week period, I called up Razi Hamad and said, Razi, there's a new man in town. Let's try again. Let's see what we can get started. Razi immediately sent me a proposal, a revised proposal from the one that he'd sent me in the summer, and I started forwarding this information to Maidan. Maidan said later in press briefings and in conversations that when he came into the job, he immediately found on his desk requests from tens of governments, individuals, Israelis, people from all over the world who said they had connections and wanted to help. And as an experienced intelligence officer, he said the first thing that you do is clear the noise. This is all noise that takes away resources and makes it difficult for you to concentrate on the real issues. The problem that Maidan had was that everything was a dead end. There were no mediators. There were no Egyptians, there were no Norwegians, there were no Turks. No one was involved doing anything. The negotiations, the contacts with Hamas were dead, nothing. And then all of a sudden I appeared and started delivering messages. Well, Maidan thought, his intuition told him that something was different here. The quality of the messages, the nature of the messages that I was sending him, mostly by SMS, were different and they should be looked into. So the intelligence services in Israel began to, at that point, I guess, listen to me, and discovered that my messages were going to Ghazi Hamad, were going to Ahmed Jabri, back to Ghazi Hamad, to me and to Maidan. There was a direct line of communication to the person holding Gilad Shalit. This was very new because for 5 years in trying to communicate to Ahmed Jabri, it would take weeks and sometimes months before there were responses to any messages. And now all of a sudden, within an hour, several times a day, there were messages going back and forth. And they began testing, telling me what I should ask and what I should say. They were essentially testing whether or not I was delivering the messages as they were saying it and whether or not I was reporting back and forth.
Just tell us what month we're in now.
We're in May of this year. I then called Nader al-Asser, the guy who had been the Egyptian intelligence officer in Tel Aviv, and informed him that this back channel was running. And I told Nader that I was speaking to Ghazi every day, and he laughed at me on the phone. He said, Gershon, you're not talking to Ghazi once a day, you're talking to Ghazi about 5 times a day. He said, everyone's listening, this is an open channel. And my communication was being listened to by the Egyptian intelligence, by the Hamas intelligence, by the Israeli intelligence. Everyone was looking at this and discovered that this was what they call a hot wire. This was real. And I was asked then to communicate messages directly. An official channel of communication opened up. The negotiations began. And what we wanted to eventually receive from the Hamas was a kind of set of principles that would be the basis for closing the deal. David Maidan kept saying to me, ask them what, from their point of view, closes the deal. The other important message that I was giving Ghazi Hamad all the time, that David Maidan was telling me, was that Netanyahu made a decision to reach an agreement. I knew that this was real because in the first meeting that I had with David Maidan, he described to me his first conversation with Netanyahu about this. This is in April 18th. David said that Netanyahu sat with me and said to me, David, you know me. I am against this deal. It goes against everything I believe in. I'm against negotiating with terrorists. I'm against releasing terrorists from prison. I think this is bad for Israel. But we have no other way of getting Shalit home, and we have to bring him home now. If we don't bring him home now, we may not be able to. When David told me this, I had always believed, for the 5 years before that I was involved in trying to start negotiations, that the key was in the Prime Minister's hand. Now, I want to preface this by saying, the bad guys in this picture, from my point of view, are Hamas. Hamas violated international law. They didn't observe international law in the way that they held an abducted soldier. They always told me that Gilad Shalit was being kept well and was being kept according to Islamic law, according to Sharia. They told me to check it. I looked and saw what Sharia said about keeping a prisoner, and it said they had to give him medical treatment, they had to give him nourishment, they had to give him a roof over his head. They gave all 3 of those things. With all due respect to Sharia, international law demands more. And they were in violation of international law throughout the time of this abduction. But nonetheless, in my mind, the key was in the Prime Minister's hand. And once the Prime Minister made a decision, in my first meeting with David Maidan, I said, David, Failure is not an option. We are going to bring Gilad Shalit home. I have the sense that this was it. Netanyahu made the decision we were going to do it. So the message I was delivering to Razi Hamad from David Meidan, who said, once we agree on principles, 3 intensive days of negotiations, we close the deal. They got the message that the time was right, and they were willing now to begin to be flexible.
So we've come a remarkable distance. It's been a slow process, but kind of from that first conversation with the professor, presumably at first not quite knowing even when you were getting the right phone calls, that these people are the people who can be accountable for Shalit. There must have always been that nervousness at the start.
For me, it wasn't a nervousness of whether or not they were actually holding Shalit. For me, it was a question of whether or not Shalit was actually still alive. The last sign of life that we had was in September of 2009. When we began the negotiations in May of this year, they refused to deliver a sign of life. And there was always a suspicion in my mind that the reason that they weren't delivering a sign of life was because they couldn't. And I was always suspicious about that. I was always scared about that. There was a crisis for me 2 weeks before the deal was completed, that after Israel had agreed to the final negotiated deal, that the Egyptians had closed, Hamas disappeared. I couldn't reach Razi Hamad on the phone. I couldn't reach anyone that I was in contact with in the Hamas, and I thought, this is it. They're not signing because they can't. They can't deliver. There was always a suspicion in Israel that Jabari didn't want a deal. They spent 2 years trying to understand who this guy is and doing psychological profiles of him and pulling out files and trying to figure it out. And the Israeli analysis was that Jabari doesn't want a deal. That one of the sources of his power was the fact that he was holding Shalit. And giving up Shalit was too big a card for him. Even the prison release would in the end of the day, weaken his powers. The Israelis understood it. One of the things that they had as verification for that was that Jabari kept changing the list of names. Even in the second round of official negotiations that began in Cairo in August, late August, September, I think it was, the second round of negotiations in September, where it was agreed that the list, what the German negotiator called the VIPs, these are the worst, the arch terrorists, the worst ones that were on the list to be released. Jabari shows up with a list of 153 names. And the Israelis went home and told the Egyptians, we're not going to do this. If we doesn't stick to what we agreed, basing it on the German list of names, we have no negotiation, let alone not an agreement. I went to Egypt actually the next week and met with the Egyptian negotiators, and the main thing that they wanted to know from me was how strong Israel was about sticking to this list. Would Israel open up the pool of names, as they called it? And my message to the Egyptians was absolutely not. This was a game breaker from the Israeli point of view. Because the Israeli security services had spent months going through the list of names and making a profile for each person and determining what level of danger they presented to the Israeli public and how they had to be dealt with. If they could be released to the West Bank, if they could be sent to Gaza, if Israel was going to be demanded that they be deported abroad. Every one of these people had a profile in the negotiation that they spent months working, and to open up the pool sets us back for months again. So this was a dead end. And the other thing at that point, and this was very important that I told the Egyptians, was the Egyptians needed now to put an Egyptian program on the table. We're now in September, and we just had a crisis because there was a terrorist attack near Eilat. We had 3 days of bombing back and forth between Israel and Gaza, with several people killed in Gaza and one Israeli killed. And I was afraid that not only would this break down the negotiations, but we would end up with a lot more people killed, and that would make everything more difficult. So Razi Hamad and I spent 3 days on the telephone transferring messages. David Meidan was sending my SMSs from Hamas directly to Benny Gantz, the chief of staff, and to the prime minister, and to there were 6 or 7 people in Israel who knew about the secret channel. They were getting these messages about ceasefire. During the month of August, during this terrorist attack, I had 1,750 SMSs on my telephone. This is the extent that the messages were going back and forth, and we managed to have a ceasefire after 3 days and move on with the negotiations. But I said that the Egyptians now had to put their own plan on the table, because if not, the Israelis and the Palestinians would go back and forth on every sentence, on every name. So the Egyptians actually did that in the next round. They came in, And then they started applying political pressure on the Hamas leadership to make Jabri more disciplined.
Now, there's something that you touched on before and we didn't go into, which was, of course, in the midst of everything that you're talking about, there was this enormous kind of enormously unsettling spring in the Middle East and the regime change in Egypt. When that first happened, what did you feel that was going to do to negotiations over Shalit?
You know, by watching the events in Cairo, I don't know about you folks, but I was glued to Al Jazeera 24 hours a day. I was watching Tahrir Square, and it was, my heart and my mind was with the people in Tahrir Square, and I was very happy to see what was happening there. It was very exciting. And beyond all of what was happening, what we were watching was happening, in the back of my mind, I said that the end of the Mubarak regime would be good for the Shalit negotiations. Mubarak was not interested in this prison deal, the prisoner exchange deal, and he did not give the Egyptian intelligence the green light to make this deal happen. I thought the Egyptians was dragging their feet. It had a lot to do with the very complex set of interests that exist between Egypt and Gaza, Egypt and Hamas, including the whole issue with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Getting rid of the Mubarak regime and legalizing the Muslim Brotherhood gave the Egyptians a new tool in their relationship with Hamas, and I thought this was a tool of leverage that Egypt would now have over Hamas, which was critical when the final crunch came in the negotiations, because the Egyptians had to apply pressure, and they had pressure to apply on Hamas because of Hamas's desire to normalize its relations with Egypt. In addition, now we have what's happening in Syria. Hamas are Sunni Muslims, Palestinians. The Assad regime had attacked refugee camps in Syria. Hamas is associated with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is part of the opposition in Syria. For at least the last month and a half, Hamas has been implementing an operation that they call slow exit. They have been withdrawing from Syria and moving out of Syria to other places. The main place that they're moving to is Cairo. This is very important because, again, it gave power to the Egyptians, if they were willing to use it, to push Hamas into an agreement. And this is what happened. And this is what, as I was watching Tahrir, this is what I was thinking about, how this is going to be beneficial for the Shalit negotiations.
So we're at September. The Jewish holidays are coming up, which kind of slows everything down in Israel. I actually remember meeting with you, I think it was late August actually, and we were talking, and you said, you know, I've got a really good story for you if you can just wait a few days. And it was obviously more than a few days before this came through. Things, as you said, there were various delays. But when you were getting to the middle of September, did you think this was going to happen, in the Jewish holiday season, or did you think that it was going to be put back and then it would have been, perhaps not till early November?
Well, by the Jewish holidays, the Egyptians have now, after my visit to Cairo, the Egyptians had put down their own proposal on the table. Once they put down their own proposal on the table, it became time for the intensive negotiations. And they said that the intensive negotiations would start after the Jewish holidays. And as David Megan had said earlier, 3 days of intensive negotiations, we can work out a deal. It actually went to not 3 days, it was 48 hours of direct negotiations, round the clock. They sat with a list. The head of the Israeli Shin Bet went to Cairo as well, and they were sitting, going over every single name and making its determination. This was all based on something that we forgot to mention, that on July 14th, I received an email document from Razi that came from Jabri, which was the breakthrough document. This was the document in which the Hamas had written for the first time the conditions for closing the deal. It was the first time in 5 years that Hamas talked about finality, ending the negotiations. And in every single category that had to be negotiated, the VIPs, the so-called VIPs, the Israeli Arabs, the East Jerusalem and Palestinians, the number of deportees from West Bank to Gaza, the willingness of having people from the VIP list being deported abroad forever. All these issues, Hamas not only demonstrated flexibility. From the July 14th document, we knew what the maximum deal would look like. The assumption was, if this piece of paper indicates the maximum that they're demanding, this is a whole new negotiation, and on the basis of that document, Meidan went to Netanyahu and said, this is what we've been waiting for. Meidan got a green light from Netanyahu to open up those negotiations, and then he went to Cairo. What's important to know about David Meidan's name, Meidan, is a Hebraicized name. The name that he grew up with was Mosseri. What's Mosseri? It's the Hebrew version of Masri. Like the Masri family, David Meidan's family comes from Egypt. He's of Egyptian descent. He speaks Arabic with an Egyptian accent, and the minute that he flew to Cairo and met Nader al-Assad, General Nader al-Assad from the Egyptian intelligence service, who had lived for 6 years in Tel Aviv, they had an instant chemistry between them, and it was decided that we would move the final round of negotiations to Cairo, because the thought was that we were going to conduct these negotiations by Skype, because we couldn't agree on a third party that we were going to, but then it was decided Egypt. So the negotiations went into intensive mode, and the Jewish holidays, everything slowed down, but after them they continued. Then David came back from Cairo, and I knew there was an agreement, and we were waiting for the Hamas to respond. And all the communications I had from David Meidan at that point were, Gershon, sit down, be quiet. No initiatives, no phone calls, wait. We're waiting now, we're waiting now, we're waiting now, we're waiting now. On Monday night, before the agreement was announced, I received an SMS from David saying, let's meet tomorrow in Tel Aviv, Tuesday afternoon in Tel Aviv. I'll give you a call in the morning and I'll tell you what time and what place. I went to Tel Aviv, I made some meetings in Tel Aviv, I saw some people, and I'm waiting for David's phone call and it doesn't come. And I send him SMS, David, I'm in Tel Aviv, where are you? And I get no answer. This is very unusual because now since May, we're in now, what month are we in? We're in October. Every time I had SMS David or called him, I immediately got a response. Unless he was in Cairo, or unless he was sitting with the Prime Minister. He would send me, even at 2 o'clock in the morning, I would send him an SMS and he would answer me immediately. So I knew something was going on, and I thought that he was either in Cairo and there's a crisis, or he's sitting with Netanyahu and something's happening. Well, at 7:30, there was an announcement on Al Arabiya television that there was an agreement. At 8 o'clock, Israeli Ynet announced that the government was called to come to a meeting to vote on the agreement. I got in my car and drove up to the Prime Minister's office and waited, sent David a message that he was in the Prime Minister's office, said, David, I'm waiting for you outside to give you a hug. He ended up leaving the government meeting, went till 2 o'clock in the morning. David left at about 10:30. He exited through a back door to avoid the press. He got in his car and he called me and said, Gershon, we did it. And that was just an amazing feeling.
Mm-hmm. But of course, I think everybody feared that even after the agreement was made, there could be a last-minute glitch.
Right. The big fear was what physical state and mental state we would find Gilad Shalit.
But also that there could be a glitch with the agreement.
There was also a fear that some of the rogue forces were going to start shooting Qassam or grad rockets into Israel, and that would create an escalation, and that would cancel the deal. The big fear was that if there were casualties in Israel as a result of rocket fire from Gaza, that would turn off the Israeli public to the deal, and Netanyahu couldn't go through with it. And God forbid that people should be killed, and an Israeli response would. So there were some very tense days there. It was very, very up in the air of whether or not this was going to happen.
And on the morning of the exchange itself, of course, there was the issue with the female prisoners.
This was not a real issue. This was a last-minute attempt of Hamas to get something new. The Egyptians, I called the Egyptians as soon as the issue came up, and Nader al-Assad told me, forget about it. There's a deal is a deal. We shook hands on it. They're not getting anything else that's outside of this deal. So he said the Egyptians would make sure that the women prisoners was not going to prevent it. But the big question was, what's the state of Gilad? coming back, and would the prisoner exchange go smoothly? Would everyone get out? Would it be transferred on time? The whole thing was a really big operation. When I sat with David that first time in May, we sat at a coffee shop on Palmach Street in Jerusalem, after we had spent about 2 hours talking to each other, introducing each other, and getting to know each other, I looked at him and said, I have one request. He looked at me like I was going to ask him for $1 million or something. I said, when we bring Gilad home, I want to be there when he crosses over. And he said, if it's possible, you'll be there. Well, when they worked out all the details, he said, Gershon, I'm really sorry it's not possible. But the minute that Gilad crosses from Gaza into Israel, I will send you a message that he's in our hands and on Israeli soil. And in fact, when David received Gilad in the Egyptian side of Rafah and crossed with him over to the border, he sent a text message to 2 people, to Noam Shalit and to me. We further communicated during the day, and it was really a very emotional experience. I've been approached by some Palestinian friends who are peace activists in Ramallah and people who are former prisoners themselves, and asked me if I would come to meet a group of prisoners who were released in the exchange. I must say it's a big dilemma for me, because for me, I did it to bring Gilad Shalit home. I personally believe that Palestinian prisoners should be freed in the framework of a peace deal. When countries at war, when people at war make peace, there's usually a general amnesty to people who are combatants and fighters. And I would hope that when we reach peace between Israel and Palestine, there will be a general amnesty for people who fought against, and they would be released. I don't like the idea of releasing prisoners because an Israeli soldier was abducted. And I fear that it, like everyone else does, that it just gives more incentives to kidnap Israeli soldiers, and God forbid we should be in this situation again. So I have a dilemma. Also, 94% of the Palestinian prisoners who were released in the 477 who were released, 94% of them killed Israelis. This is not a simple deal. People can say, Palestinians say, Gilad Shalit was a soldier and he was fighting against Palestine. I don't think Gilad Shalit personally killed anyone. He was a tankist who was sitting in a tank on the Israeli side of an international border. So this is a real difficult issue. It's a difficult dilemma. I'll go further than that. The person who murdered my wife's cousin was released in the deal. He spent 6 years in prison for murdering my wife's cousin with a butcher's knife. He didn't shoot him. He didn't blow him up with a bomb. He killed him with a knife. My wife's cousin family called me on the morning that the deal was announced, and for half an hour on the phone were yelling at me, his wife and his children. All I could do was listen. I wasn't going to argue with her. I could voice my empathy and the sense of injustice. Her husband was not a settler. He wasn't a soldier. He was an Israeli who happened to be he was a person who had a lot of Palestinian friends. He did business with Palestinians. He bought and sold equipment for restaurants. And he was called by a Palestinian to go to Ramallah to buy equipment to sell in Israel. And he went there and he was abducted by Hamas and he was murdered. So this is not an easy thing for me. There are a lot of dilemmas here, and no doubt. For me, nonetheless, this is the most important thing that I've ever done in my life. Bringing Gilad Shalit home alive and well. Much better condition than anyone imagined. And he's doing well, he's being treated. He had an operation on Friday for removing shrapnel that was in his arm for 5 years and 4 months. He didn't see sunlight. He had sufficient food. They gave him a television and a radio. He had paper to write a journal, which we're trying to get now. They didn't let him take it out with him. We're trying now to get Hamas to agree to let him have his journal, his notes that he kept when he was there, and hopefully that will happen. But it was really a miracle that after 5 years and 4 months, we were able to bring him out and he's home with his family. I'm going to see him maybe in another week and a half. It'll be my first time to meet him and to see the family.
I mean, we've obviously just heard now the very emotional part of the story for you. And it's difficult to step away from that emotion and ask perhaps for a more analytical approach to what can be learned from all of this. Are the lessons for next time this might happen, or are the lessons on a broader level of the future of peace in the region, Israeli-Palestinian relations?
For me, the most important lesson to be learned here is the importance of the personal development of trust between individuals. The messages that were starting going back and forth at the first part of the official negotiations that I was running was that Israel doesn't trust Hamas and Hamas doesn't trust Israel. They didn't believe anything that each other said, and the fact that after 5 years of constant contact between me and Razi Hamad, we had developed a personal relationship of trust. We didn't agree on political issues, but on a personal level of talking to each other hundreds of times over 5 years, of chatting on the internet, of SMSs, of phone calls early in the morning and phone calls late at night, that went beyond talking about Gilad Shalit or ceasefires, that went into talking about wishing the family well and having a happy holiday, and when someone was ill, of concern, of a human contact. The human contact and trust between the two of us is what enabled this negotiation to happen. Because when the stuff got tough, when the messages were hard, when I had to tell Razi Hamad that they were crossing a point that Netanyahu could not accept in their demands, Razi Hamad understood from me that what I was telling him was the truth. It was not a negotiating tactic trying to squeeze more concessions from Hamas. And when he likewise told me what were the limits of Jabari, how far could Jabari go in his compromises, that message was communicated as is with a high degree of trust to the Israeli side. So this was the #1 message, and I say again today, when we look at the relations between the government of Israel and the Palestinian Authority led by Mahmoud Abbas, there is not zero trust, there's negative trust, complete and total mistrust. Praised his leadership. And the reason why I did that, because in my mind, Netanyahu demonstrated leadership, real leadership, because leadership is not when you make easy decisions. Leadership is when on the balance scale you have competing values. And on Netanyahu's scale, there was the value of not negotiating, or the principle of not negotiating with terrorists, of not rewarding terrorists. And on the other side of the scale was the principle and the value of social solidarity, and what we call the non-written covenant that exists between the government of Israel and the people of Israel that enables Israel to have a people's army. And it's really interesting. One of the Hamas negotiators was a guy named Salah Haruri. Salah Haruri is from the West Bank. He was expelled last year and he's in Damascus. And he was one of the 3 Palestinian negotiators in Cairo with Jabari. Haruri speaks fluent Hebrew. He spent a lot of years in Israeli prison. He was interviewed last week by 2 different Israeli media agencies, and he said something which was fascinating, which goes back to this idea of social solidarity. Salah Haruri said, "I wish that it was reversed, that it was us who had won, willing to exchange for 1,027. Showing the value that Israel society put on this one soldier who became the son of every Israeli. Salah Haruri commented on this is the real strength of Israeli society, and I thought it was quite ironic that here's this leader from Hamas, the person who is responsible for establishing Ezzedin al-Qassam forces in the West Bank, was commenting this about Israeli society. So that's what many Israelis said to me, you made us feel proud to be Israelis. And the other thing that people said was, you gave us hope. Well, I didn't go into that message, you gave us hope, but for me, my interpretation of it was that if we can talk to Hamas and achieve something, then maybe peace really is possible. That was the message that I got from many, many Israelis.
Okay, I think it would be nice if we give people a chance to ask questions, because I know you have more to say.
I guess, well, it's good to hear from you the other side. There is one name, I'm more concerned. Of course, I'm happy for what happened. I'm happy for the families that they are enjoying their, those who were denied their freedom. There is one thing missing, to my opinion. When Marwan Barouti was dropped from the list.
To the best of my knowledge, Marwan Barouti's name was on the list till the very end. The problem is, quite honestly, that the only ones who wanted Marwan Barouti released, who really wanted Marwan to be on the list, were the Egyptians. Hamas was willing to sacrifice Marwan in favor of getting someone else from Hamas. The Israelis had no desire to release Marwan. And there was no pressure coming from Ramallah to include Marwan on the list. So, this is a bargaining game, and you fight for what you want, and there was no one fighting for Marwan Barouti on the list. Believe me, if I had gotten a signal from Ramallah, and there were people who knew that, they didn't know I was running a secret channel, but there were people who knew that I could get messages to the people in negotiations. They had an opportunity to tell me, we really want Marwan. I would have fought for Marwan to be on the list. Marwan's a friend of mine. I spent a lot of time with him. I was hoping that he would be on the list, but I couldn't go and say, this is really important to President Abbas. This is really important to I don't know who. But no one said it. And I couldn't make a case for him.
So there was no political will, actually, on all sides?
There was, except the Egyptians. The Egyptians wanted Marwan released.
Yeah, because, okay, clear.
Nathan, you started the discussion by calling Gershon naïve, which he called himself. The most naive thing I saw was when you were on TV, Gershon, or I think it was Channel 1 or Channel 2, and the woman said to you, how could you possibly have contact with Hamas? It was so naive of her, and you said, of course you can. There's Facebook, there's SMS, and there's cell phones. I couldn't believe when she said that.
I tell a story about a year ago. One of the leaders of Hamas asked me to be his friend on Facebook. Everything's possible today.
Is it on?
It's on.
Oh, it's great what you have done. I think it is. At one time you told me that you thought Shalit is dead, right?
Yeah.
Okay, what you did was great. Until the very end. I wish you went and met with the prisoners and heard the story of everybody. They are not just outright killers going to kill. There is psychology behind all these things that happened. When you see Muhammad Baoudias and Hudra being shot, I saw him on TV, probably you saw him on TV. The father was trying to shield his son. He was shocked. What reaction for the viewers would be, for the father would be. I had cousins being killed. You hear the story about the two old men and women in the field gathering their olives, and settler or somebody just shot him because there was exchange of fire the days before. So here is psychology of war. Everybody had that painful story. I was 14 years old. I was shot in the arm in front of my house. I was studying. I had exam next day, and I saw somebody with a sling hit me. I didn't know about this thing. I had 3-inch mortar exploded next to me in the old city. For my good luck, or I don't know, it went down in a manhole, just went down. if you won't believe, if you just want to drop it, you'll have difficulty. Went down, and I didn't know what was happening. I ran out, there was no chance. I throw myself on the floor or get out from the place where I ran out, and it went down and exploded under the ground. And of course, stones blew up. So there was really sad stories. One can't get justice. Many bad stories here. Oh, sad, all over it's war, and it's real bad war because non-ending. It's not a war that ends and stops and we have peace. It is unfortunate. It's very sad. The other thing, why this mortgage, I call it mortgage, why didn't they release all the prisoners at one shot?
All the prisoners in one shot?
Together, yeah.
The two.
Yeah, why postponing? Is it just for good behavior?
No, okay.
Thank you.
The second question first. The idea of separating it into two phases was actually developed by the Egyptian mediators way back at the beginning, and the reason was because Hamas was going to get 450 released, and the Egyptians said to Israelis, to Olmert at the time, release more for Abu Mazen. So that was the idea of the separation, that the release of the 550 later would be Fatah, would be released for Abu Mazen to strengthen Abu Mazen after strengthening Hamas. That was the evolution of the two list of names. And that stuck as the framework from the time when the Egyptians brought it up. Look, with regard to talking to the Palestinian prisoners who were released, the 33 years that I've been living in this country and doing peace work, I've always had a principle that I've stuck to, and I will continue to stick to. I'm willing to talk to anyone who is willing to talk to me, period. The only condition I have is that they're not pointing a gun at me. If there are Palestinian prisoners who are released in this deal, who are interested in talking to me and are committed not going back to violence against me and my people, I am more than willing to sit and talk with them. Some of my best Palestinian friends were former terrorists. The biggest Palestinian peace advocates I know are people who spent many years in Israeli prisons. My best Palestinian friends. So I'm not opposed to speaking to people who were released in this prisoner deal. I'm not even opposed to talking to people who killed Israelis. My one condition is that they don't have plans to go and kill more Israelis.
How would you know?
I don't, other than their own word. So if people want to talk to me and they're saying, we want to make peace with Israel, I'm more than willing to go and talk to them.
When they come out from prison, they have experiences. They must have reflected. Some of them may come and will become more bloodthirsty, and others may be looking for peace. Come on, this has to come an end.
No, I believe that the majority of those people who came out of prison now are interested in living a normal life, of building a family, of getting married, of having children, of being with their children and their families, of having a job and not remaining a combatant. Plus the environment in which we're living today is very different than in the past. People don't want to return to another round of violence, both in the West Bank and in Gaza. In Gaza, the Hamas wants to fortify and solidify the ceasefire with Israel. No one wants to go back to violence now. I shouldn't say no one. The majority of Israelis and the majority of Palestinians do not want to return to violence.
Gershon, but now, maybe you have to have a different message now. We feel here as Palestinians, we are being suffocated. So this is this is something that the pressure may explode at one time and can't be contained. You feel it. You see the people around.
Well, believe me, the fact that I was made into an official channel has opened up for me doors in Israel that were always closed to me. And if there's one thing that the Israeli establishment has learned about me, is that I don't stop. So,
did you want to comment on this discussion here?
Yes, because I mean, you know, what Iskander has said is something interesting. You know, I mean, we will face more problems because of the occupations. And I wish that the total, you know, deal was done with Shalit. It's the right time when to include the PLO, Hamas, everyone in this deal for a major settlement. But I think the political will is not there. I think everyone did it for his own reason, but not for the better state of the future two countries.
I can only agree that the political will is not there, and I can only hope that it will come soon, just as Netanyahu changed his mind with regard to the prisoner deal for different reasons. I'm hoping that he will also change his mind about the willingness to make peace with the Palestinians. I believe, you know, Sami, my beliefs very well, that I think that Israel has never had a better Palestinian partner than we have now. And I think it would be a tragic mistake if we lose this opportunity to make peace with Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah today. And I think that making peace with the West Bank is not making peace with the West Bank, it's making peace with Palestine, because Gaza has to be included. And Gaza will be included when and if there's a regime in Gaza that agrees to the agreement. And that will bring about a speed up in the changes that are already taking place in Hamas. Hamas is going through real changes today, and either those changes will be speeded up or Hamas will be changed by the people in Gaza. But I think this is a real opportunity. And unfortunately, I believe that the lack of political will mainly exists in Israel. I want, as an Israeli, I want Netanyahu to be the one to make peace with the Palestinians, not Yossi Beilin. I want Netanyahu to do it, because if he doesn't, he brings along 70 to 80% of the Israeli public. If someone from the center or someone from the left in Israel is the prime minister and they make peace with Palestine, we have a divided Israeli society. We'll have a civil war in Israel, maybe. So we need Netanyahu to do it. I hope that I, with my current connections, can try to influence Netanyahu to move in that direction. I don't know if I can. I have the ears of people, as I said, that would never listen to me before. I don't know if they'll continue to listen to me and for how long they'll continue to listen to me. But I'm 100% convinced that this is where we have to go. And I agree with you that the prisoner exchange has to be the opening of the progress made between Israel and the Palestinians. It has to be the beginning of the opening of Gaza, of the end of the economic siege on Gaza. By the way, it was reported today that it's beginning to happen. Israel has now agreed to double the amount of agricultural produce leaving Gaza this coming season, and has now agreed to have furniture produced in Gaza to be exported from Gaza. So this is the beginning of a change in the Israeli policy to open the economy of Gaza more. This has to be speeded up. We have to put the people in Gaza back to work. We have to normalize the relations there and reunite the Gaza and the West Bank economy. All these things are essential, I think, to creating an atmosphere for making peace.
Are there any other questions relating directly to the Shalit issue?
Last one.
Gershon, relating to you, for you, what is Israel doing? This is the best opportunity for Israel to make peace. And they are not underdogs anymore. They are fighting dogs. They are close to God. They are very much fortified. They can afford to make peace. What's scaring them?
I'll tell you what's scaring them. What's scaring them, when you look at the neighborhood, from Israeli perspective, put on an Israeli pair of glasses now. And what you see is
Jewish glasses.
Jewish glasses, Israeli glasses, whatever glasses you want to put on. Look at it from the way that an Israeli sees the region. What we see is Hezbollah, which is a front line of Iran to the north of us. We see Gaza being run by Islamic fundamentalists, Hamas, which is Muslim Brotherhood, and even more extreme than Hamas is the Islamic Jihad, which is a direct threat to Israel because they are agents of Iran. They receive their funding and their weapons from Iran. We have Tunisia, which just held elections, democratic elections, and 40% of the people in Tunisia voted for the Islamic fundamentalist party. We have Egypt next door, who's going to hold elections there, and probably 30 to 40% of the people in Egypt are going to vote for the Muslim Brotherhood. We have Syria, whose regime has kept a quiet border with Israel since 1975, is about to fall, and the people likely to take over in Syria are the Muslim Brotherhood. We have a Jordanian regime, which if the Hashemite kingdom falls, it will be taken over by the Muslim Brotherhood. We have a very precarious neighborhood. We have a report which just came out from the United Nations that says that Iran has a nuclear weapons program. The Israeli perspective is that this is not a time when peace can be made. We have to build our walls taller and stronger. This is how Israel sees the neighborhood. It's a very threatening, scary picture. I have different answers to it than the way the Israeli government sees it. But this is the way that most Israelis see the neighborhood. And it's important to understand that.
Gershon, there is another thing. Sorry, that I'm... The Muslim thing is something that is new. I mean, it's a symptom of the problem. Our issue, it has nothing to do with Jewishness or Islam. It has nothing to do. It has to do with the reality of the ground. And this is where we shouldn't really deal with the symptoms. We should deal with the issue.
I agree entirely, Samuel. Your argument's not with me, but from the Israeli perspective, they will tell. I would say to the Israelis that an Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement is not going to change developments in Egypt. But it will have an impact on the way that the Arab world views Israel. The peace that Israel has with Egypt, the peace with Israel and Jordan is a piece of paper. It's a formal agreement. The Arab people of the region hate Israel. And the reason why they hate Israel is because of how they understand Israel treats the Palestinian people. And if we could remove this huge thorn from the flesh that every Arab feels, then the Arab people in the region would perceive Israel differently, I would hope. I'm not naive to think that this is something that happens overnight. But this dimension is essential for Israel to be accepted in the region. Well, I think the region has real problems that it has to deal with. And the fact that the Muslim fundamentalists are coming to power in different parts of the region are problems of the Arab regimes that were in power for so long and didn't allow real democracy to exist there. And the only place that people could organize was in the mosque. And this is the fact that these Islamic parties are very well organized. And there are 112 political parties in Egypt running for elections. The only ones who are organized are the two parties that are associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. So this is a real dimension. So it's not going to resolve all the problems, but it will make a difference, certainly in the way that we're perceived here. And I think it's essential, not only for the reason of interest, but also because it's the moral thing to do as well. I don't want to occupy other people.
Aren't the current developments in the region the reason why exactly now is the moment that Israel should consider in its own interest to make peace with Palestinians, to make peace with the Palestinians?
I think it's another reason. It's not the only reason, and I wish that we would.
Okay, well, it's been a fascinating story, and we've been left with lots of food.